its existence, Health Workforce New Zealand developed some very serious intelligence around the workforce, but when it came the last 5 years to actually translate that intelligence into investment and planning, the recidivist forces within the health system, I'm afraid, first corrupted and then actually dislocated the plan altogether. And the current plan within the Ministry of Health is to turn the Health Workforce Unit into an industrial relations support unit. So what I'm going to talk about is what's happening in other jurisdictions and certainly not in New Zealand. So I'm going to talk about workforce planning and development. And the first observation I'd make is that almost all the information we have is related to medicine, because we have almost no research about any of the other healthcare workforces. And that's a pity, because we're heading in the next 2 or so years to a nursing shortage, in my opinion, of greater than 20,000 in New Zealand, and a nursing shortage in Australia of greater than 100,000. And we do not have a plan to deal with that particular issue. And ironically, the improved remuneration of nurses will accelerate the movement of nurses out of the workforce or into part-time work. Ironically, the demonstration of the futility of workforce planning came when we signalled in 2009 we were heading to a nursing shortage. We signalled again in 2011 and 2014. Why did nothing happen? Well, the reason is because at the time DHBs were struggling to employ first-year nurses. So the argument there's going to be a nursing shortage down the road was of no interest to people whose immediate problem was employing first-year nurses and being criticised for not employing them all. And so long as our health system exists in an annualised budgetary environment and is held accountable for activity, you will not see out-year planning. You simply will not see out-year planning. And in fact, we walked into the nursing strike recently fully aware of what the issues were, and sadly, one of the outcomes of that strike was an accord to try and look at nurse retention. That should have been in place 5 years before, not as a response to a strike, but as a proactive way of saying, how do we achieve the flexibility that nurses are looking for, the autonomy they're looking for, the ability to manage the increasingly old, sick people that require them to look after? None of that is in place. So we're left with a situation where the only real information we have is around medicine. And this is a view that I hold quite strongly. For publicly funded medical schools and other health worker educators, there should be an explicit social contract. And that contract only has a utility if it's expressed as better higher order health outcomes. What do I mean by higher order? I mean employment, housing, and those sorts of measures. Not very banal health measures. I'm talking about higher order social measures. Does such a social contract exist for our medical schools? Well, I ran a medical school. I can assure you I was never asked to sign a contract like that, but I should have been. But what I am doing here is exempting private medical schools, because clearly a private medical school has no obligation to anybody or anything. In a place where I teach in Boston, for example, I teach at the Harvard Macy Institute. If I look at Harvard University, as many as half of their medical graduates never practice medicine. They go into biotech companies or they go into the financial industry. They never practice a minute of medicine after they graduate. Now that would be an unacceptable outcome for a publicly funded medical school. This is the rub though, there are no data to show that any current medical student selection process or under or postgraduate education program is responsible for improved health outcomes in served communities. If we have such a social contract, we're not even measuring it. If we are held accountable for the people we produce in terms of the impact they have on the health of our communities, we wouldn't know whether we're doing a good job or a bad job. And as I'll talk about in a minute, in terms of student selection, singularly in my time running Auckland Medical School, the most difficult and problematic thing you do is choosing who to admit to medical school. And I'd suggest that our selection processes at the moment are way off the mark. They belong in the 1850s, not in a modern world. And in the case of people like Derek, who have procedural skills they need to do, we don't even measure dexterity or hand-eye skills before we recruit people into medicine. Yet a lot of them we expect to take up artisanal activities, and which rely on absolute dexterity, depth perception, and so on. We don't even measure it. You imagine recruiting pilots and not actually measuring whether they had hand-eye skills and the necessary coordination to carry out complex motor tasks. This is the worst bit. I fought very hard for affirmation in Māori, largely because my mother was Māori. I grew up in a very poor Māori community. But the truth is, we have no evidence whatsoever that the affirmation selection processes that we are using for underserved communities have made a scrap of difference to the health of those communities. We have absolutely no evidence of it. We operate on the fact that it's intuitively, properly true. It has high face validity, but we actually aren't measuring. With affirmation only makes sense if the consequence of affirmation is the people we're affirming for end up with better health outcomes. This lack of validity for medical student selection is hardly surprising. First of all, education and health systems are dislocated with respect to governance and management. Education systems, Ministry of Education, Tertiary Education Commission, health systems, Ministry of Health, they are not even convergent, they're certainly not parallel. And that's the reason why really innovative, high quality health providers like Kaiser Permanente have said, we don't trust the education system, we're going to run our own medical school to train people for our system who know how to work in our system. And the Germans are doing it too. The Germans have gone to apprenticeship training of nurses and doctors in many of the German provinces. It's a 4-year degree for the nurses, for example. They spend 3 months nursing, 3 months at the university. Does this sound familiar to any of the older nurses in the room? 3 months nursing, 3 months. The difference is that when the nurses go into the work environment, they're properly supported, they're not put into unsafe environments, they have the right level of responsibility, and when they go into educational models, they're receiving a world-class education from properly trained educators. It's a 4-year job trial, and they're doing exactly the same thing for medicine. They're saying, let's stop pretending that this is an apprenticeship program, let's run it like any other high-quality apprenticeship program. But that's where the education system and the health system actually become one and the same. At the moment, for example, when I was running Auckland Medical School, I was held accountable for 2 things: research funds and our standing on a global scale. When I ran the medical school, we were rated 33rd in the world, and so I was considered to be a star. We had very high research revenue. I was never, ever once asked to account for the quality of the medical students in terms of their suitability to practice medicine in New Zealand and make a difference to the health outcomes of our communities. Strange, when the person walking down the street outside Auckland Medical School, you said, what's that place all about? He or she would say, that's where they train doctors. I suspect they wouldn't say, that's where they're trying to find out how neurons chat to each other. The second thing is that few public health systems operate as a service industry and are consequently unaware of the needs and requirements of the communities that they serve from a health and wellbeing perspective. It's a sad truism that we operate, all of us in this room, in a service industry that has little idea of what our consumers want or need or expect. And I'll give you an example of that. Here's the European countries: Sweden, France, Germany, UK, Switzerland, and the Netherlands. And if you look across at the extreme right-hand column, what you're looking at there is the percentage of the community in that particular year who had an unmet health need, ranging from 13.6% in Sweden down to 1.6% in the Netherlands. The bit that I've highlighted, though, is where the unmet health need has arisen because of some factor other than cost, travel, or waiting time, some non-health factor. And you can see almost all the unmet need is not accounted for by how long you had to wait, or how long what was the cost, or how far you had to go. And so I asked the Minister of Health in Sweden, what on earth constitutes the basis of 1 in 10 Swedes having an unmet health need for some non-health system factor? And his answer was, I don't know. Can you imagine a bank or an insurance company saying 10% of our customers really don't like what we're doing, but we don't know what it is they don't like about it or what we're going to do about it? What an extraordinary difference. Cynically, I believe health systems still exist actually to meet the needs of the providers, not the needs of the consumers and patients. And this is a classic example of that. And finally, most public health systems are configured and operated in a manner better suited to the needs of Victorian England. I often laugh about how it would be if you transported a physician from the Edinburgh Infirmary of 1850 and stuck him, because it would be a him, into a modern ward round in a modern hospital, I think he would be bemused by women doctors. He would be appalled at the standard of dress. Most of the doctors look like they dress like cleaners. He would be absolutely intrigued by the technology. But the minute the ward round began, he would say, nothing has changed. The hierarchical nature, the passive consumers in their beds, nothing has changed. I feel very comfortable here.
True.
And this is a classic example. We've got to the point where we've saturated the system, where more doctors, for example, don't make any more difference. I'd like you to compare Sweden and the United Kingdom, and look, you can see Sweden has half as many doctors again as the United Kingdom, yet the waiting time barriers are exactly the same. We've got to the point where throwing more and more doctors at these high-end healthcare systems don't make a lot of difference in terms of unmet need. Going back to background, medical students are still being largely selected and trained and assessed on the basis of a skill set that is no longer particularly valuable. And I'll give you an analogy to describe that in a minute. So here's two core principles that I'd suggest, and this is what's been taken up, as I say, in other jurisdictions. An explicit understanding and alignment of the requirements of the community, as well as providers, payers, regulators, educators and other social agencies, is a prerequisite to any sensible health planning. You can't plan a health service unless you know what the entire range of users want from the damn thing. The second thing is the dog needs to be in control of its tail and not the other way around. And what I mean by that is that health need must drive the development of desirable outcomes, and in turn the outcomes must drive the development of models of healthcare and related funding approaches. And that solution sets, that is capital, IT and workforce, comes last. That's what you do at the end, not at the beginning. How do we plan health services in New Zealand? We say, what workforce do we have? What IT do we have? What capital do we have? How can we sort of aggregate that to produce some model of care? And how can we try and get that to address health need? That is front to back. So let me give you an analogy which I hope will explain where I think we are in terms of how we select and train people for medicine. It's the London taxi driver analogy, and for those of you who heard it before, I apologise. I first arrived in London in 1978. I got a taxi from Heathrow to my hotel. The hotel was Australian Palace Hotel. I had no idea where it was. The taxi driver did. The value proposition was explicit. He had knowledge that I didn't have, and I was happy to pay him for that knowledge. So I was paying for knowledge in a very clear and explicit value proposition. How is it now? I arrived at Heathrow earlier this year and I sat in the back of a cab on my way to a hotel in Covent Garden looking at my phone, and for 10 minutes before we got into a traffic jam, I knew we were going to be in a traffic jam. I had better intelligence than that driver did, and I sat there looking at my phone saying, what am I paying this person for? He wasn't particularly, he smelt, he wasn't particularly friendly, he didn't ask me, would I like to go the fast route, the slow route, the tourist route? So the question is, what am I paying for? Because the value proposition has changed. What was valuable to me, his knowledge, is no longer valuable to me because I have access to real-time, high-quality, instantaneous intelligence. And if he was to add value, it would be how I use what's available to me to make a decision. But we didn't engage in that process. And how will it be? Well, when we get to autonomous taxis, you'd have to say, I don't need that taxi driver at all. They have no value to me. And so, of course, I'm arguing, of course, that we see that dodos are extinct, bank tellers are extinct, London taxi drivers are extinct, and you can fill in the dots. Or we can look at it this way, how it was in 1978, the London taxi driver and the knowledge, and that was an exam they had to pass, still do, by the way. They recruit, the Guild of Taxi Drivers of London still recruits taxi drivers on the ability to memorise the streets of London and pass an exam. Does that sound like the Part 1 exam for physicians or other college exams? Some of you have sat memorising Harrison's textbook of medicine and regurgitating it mindlessly. The knowledge is exactly, and that was the concept of the era of medicine, in my view, where the value proposition is what we knew. People came to us with a problem, and we used our knowledge to analyse that problem and to provide advice about what the problem might be caused by and what the solution might be. The value proposition was explicit. But how it is now, Google Maps, what's the value of a taxi driver? And we are increasing in an era of participatory healthcare. And what is the value of a healthcare provider in a participatory environment? Let alone how it will be when increasingly we'll see self-management. So the question is, what were the desirable skills which underpin selection and education for a physician in the acquisition, recall and the use of knowledge and deductive reasoning was the mainstay of physician practice. And I'd add to that a whole range of around tactile, manual, motor skills, which we've never assessed in terms of those of us who have procedural obligations in our service to our community. As compared to this, what are the desirable skills for a physician to underpin selection and education when the management of knowledge in a participatory and a self-management healthcare milieu is the mainstay of physician practice? This is a different planet. This is understanding someone's coping skills. Are they a monitor? Are they a blunter? What's their illness perceptions? What's their sickness belief? Are they catastrophizers? This is, in fact, the discipline I've just described as health psychology. But the health psychological skills people require to enable people to manage information, to make the right decision for them. That's very sophisticated communication and interaction skills. Are we actually measuring those? No, we're not. Are we selecting for those? No, we're not. Are we training for those? Sadly, no, we're not. So, looking at selection on the basis of meet future need, a citizen-centric approach to health planning and the implication of this to professional roles and functions, and consequently to desirable characteristics to underpin selection and form the basis of an increasingly apprenticeship approach to medical education. So what am I actually talking about? This is a virtuous healthcare service cycle where health need is identified, the user requirements are identified, design thinking is used to develop a model of care. That model of care is then said, okay, how do we develop that? What's the solution set? What's the IT, capital and workforce? And I'll explain in a minute where they will vary. You need local solutions for local need. And then so on. So who uses this virtuous healthcare service cycle? Well, the only health services that I know, and I've reviewed 35 health systems around the world, either through audit or survey, the only place I've found this in place is in those health systems which actually have real financial risk. Real outcome risk and real financial risk. Our public health system has neither. So how do you choose a preferred solution set? Well, there's a concept of shadow price considerations. What on earth does that mean? What that means, for example, in one of the projects we're running in Waikato for the Ministry of Social Development around mental health, is that we have taken a group of Māori women who had a previous role as wardens. We've trained them to be case managers and then to manage a caseload of young Māori with drug and addiction problems. And it's working superbly. It's working superbly because it's used the traditional reality in Māoridom where you do not argue with your auntie. But the shadow price there is we took a group of unemployed Māori women and trained them and employed them. So even before we started, we had a shadow price, or we had a shadow value. The other things are looking at accounting for complexity and predictability and the role of the citizen. I'll quickly talk about those. The way in which sophisticated health systems are planning now is to say care can be predictable and simple, it can be unpredictable and simple, it can be predictable and complex, or it can be unpredictable and complex. And it makes no sense whatsoever to use a model of care that's suitable for predictable, simple needs for a model of care that's requiring unpredictable and complex needs. And by the way, the complexity usually lies not in the diagnosis, but in the delivery of care. That's where the complexity really sits. And when you think about the world in this quadrant, then you ask this question, where would virtual delivery mechanisms likely be most valuable? And the answer is predictable, simple needs. You can commoditize predictable, simple needs. And that's how Minute Clinics came to be. And the first person running the Minute Clinics in the US used to be the CEO of Burger King. Well, of course he did. He understood commoditization. You couldn't commoditize mental health, but you can commoditize urinary tract infections. Where would physicians involved in conventional clinical approaches likely be most valuable? In my view, and I might be too cynical, I believe doctors only add value when conditions become unpredictable and complex. The problem for that for you as a primary care community is that you spent your whole life in that bottom right-hand quadrant. That's exhausting. That's type 1 thinking. That's higher order thinking all day, every day. That's exhausting. There's no time off down there.
Yep.
Where would nurse practitioner-led care likely be most valuable? Where care is predictable and can follow an algorithm. Nurses follow practice models or best practice guidelines far better than doctors do, and there's very good evidence to support that. And so what you do is you apply machine learning here to shift as much as possible from the unpredictable complex quadrant to the predictable simple quadrant, because the minute you do that, you can automate it, you can virtualize it, you can actually run it as a commodity. But the point I'm making is you can see then on where would just-in-time trained and micro-credentialed health workers likely be most valuable. Actually, it's predictable complex needs. You can train someone to run a ventilator in someone's home who's ventilator dependent because you train them for that person on that ventilator in that home, in that specific setting. Here's another way some jurisdictions are going about workforce planning, and that's to say that most of us will spend most of our lives well and happy. At some stage we'll develop intercurrent health problems, and God willing, for a very small proportion of our life, will be significantly ill or injured. Now the point about this is that, is it a patient or a consumer? Well, the answer is it depends where you are in the triangle. At the base of the triangle, I'd suggest you're a health owner. In the middle of the triangle, you're a participant, a consumer, a client. When you're sick, you want to be a patient. You want to receive care. So the right name depends upon what role you have. And the point I'm going to make here to you is that not only does the name matter to the citizen as an owner of the health, as a participant, as a patient, but the health system has to be quite differently configured. If you're caring for someone who's significantly ill and injured, then that's what the health system has to be designed to do, provide holistic care. Whereas down at the bottom of it, what the health system has to provide is a supportive measure. You're there to support someone to take ownership of your health. What do we do in our health system? We take a single approach to healthcare, which is for significant illness and injury, and try and impose it down the triangle. So reform of healthcare, the reform of anything in healthcare is never easy, and the point I'm going to make to you here is this. The last meaningful reform of healthcare in New Zealand was 1938, when Michael Joseph Savage tried to introduce the concept of universality into New Zealand healthcare. Savage was an Australian. He arrived here in 1907 at the age of 35. He was our first Labour Prime Minister in 1935. And in 1938, when he introduced the social welfare system, he tried to introduce universality into healthcare, because at the time, the settlers had a very clear view that health was not a universal right, it was a privilege to be earned, which is in fact exactly the attitude that existed in the UK, still exists to some extent in Australia and in the US. He was successful in introducing universality into hospitals, but the reality was the New Zealand chapter of the British Medical Association confronted him over primary care and defeated him. Now, what you've got to ask, and it's not for today's conversation, is how is this system so recidivist that we've had no meaningful reform since 1938, just within system tinkering? I've also suggested there are two core principles. One is an explicit understanding of what the users require is an absolute prerequisite to healthcare planning, and we don't have that. We're one of the few service industries which do not have an explicit understanding. And by the way, my view about healthcare when it's planned properly is local solutions to meet local need. You do not have an homogenous delivery model. And health need must drive the development of desirable outcomes. For example, when we sat down with the mental health communities we're working with at the Ministry of Social Development, we said, what is it that you want? I can promise you that none of them said less antidepressants, better depression scores. What they said was, I want a job and dignity or to go back to education. That's what they said to us. That's the outcomes that they wanted, and that's the outcomes we're geared towards delivering. Solution sets should be locally developed and contextual. Workforce selection and development must be subservient to this process if it's to be useful. Thank you very much. Sorry to be able to do that.